All right, one for the holidays and the digital Grinches that are out there. Okay. Welcome to DOS Phone Hunt. I'm JRPR Ruth for Information Week. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about cyber threats and the holidays. We're in a time where ransomware and other types of cyber attacks have been very prevalent. But looking at, now we're in the midst of the holidays, there is that potential for essentially digital Grinches to come out of the woodwork to just try to potentially take advantage of the higher commerce that might be at play and just to like higher transactions because, well, they're mean and we don't like that. So to look at what organizations might need to deal with, which may or may not be just seasonal, brought together a very, very healthy, robust group to look at this topic. Today we have David Richardson, Vice President of Endpoint and Threat Intelligence with Lookout. Jake
Good to be
King,
here.
Head of Threat and Security Intelligence with Elastic. Mikhail Ishkhanov, Senior Director, Product Strategy and Sales Enablement with SOTI.
Thank you.
Stephanie Snow Carruthers, IBM's Global Head of Cyber Range and Chief People Hacker for IBM X-Force. Kris Lovejoy, Senior Vice President for Security with Kyndryl. And the other JP in the room, John Paul Cunningham, CISO for Silverfort. All of you, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's dive into this. John, what is at stake during the holidays? With the potential of hackers and other bad actors, what they might be going after. Could it be data that could be sold or held for ransom? Are they potentially targeting money from transactions that'll be at play during this time of year?
Well, I think that there's a lot at stake, and I'd probably break it into two different groups. There's things that are at stake for the consumer, and there's things that are at stake for the companies that are providing these services and selling these products. And I think for the consumer, it's still about your identity. Is somebody going to steal my identity? Is somebody going to impact my purchasing power by getting, my credit card and running up charges and creating a big headache for me? So, it is for the consumer, I think, a lot about protecting their identity and not being fooled because, some of the things that you see now with, just AI and some of the things that are attackers are able to do, they can stand up a fake site that looks just like the retailer site, and maybe they can grab a domain that looks very close to the retailer's domain. So when the consumer's searching and looking and typing in the URL, maybe they get directed to a false domain. So I think for the consumer, it's about not being tricked, not being fooled to go to maybe like a discount site or looking for a coupon code because everybody wants a great deal. Everybody's looking for something that can help them through the holidays. So I think it's just that kind of issue. I think is what's at stake for consumers. For companies, it is about especially if you're a retail company. This is when you get the large percentage of your revenue during the holiday time. And so if an attacker can take you offline, if they can do a denial service against your online retail site, or if they can get in, as you said, through ransomware, if they can trick your employees even through like a gift, a holiday gift, and then get into your company and put ransomware in there that they can take you offline, they can compromise your identity, they can take your financial information. So I think that, for companies, there's a lot at stake because this is such an important time for retail companies.
Gotcha. Thank you very much for that. Those insights. Okay. Mikhail, do retailers still face high levels of cyber risk in a world that's really fraught with ransomware? That their attacks that are year round. Is it more lucrative from the bad actor's perspective to kind of focus on that year round ransomware kind of attack vector versus focusing just on potentially striking during the holidays?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. I wish I could tell you that these kind of ransomware attacks are seasonal, but the reality is, what we really are facing them year round. And, these vulnerabilities in software, cyber threats are just really the norm year round from what we're seeing, right? It's unfortunate, but it's the reality that we live in today. And when we talk about retail specifically, with retailers driving towards an omni-channel experience, and a lot of time they're introducing a lot of new mobile technology, new IoT devices, different form factors. And, on average, we're seeing retailers add 2 to 3 of these new form factors per year. So the reality is there's just so many more endpoints that they have to deal with on a year-round basis that could become attack vectors. And, we look at even things like printers, which a lot of people don't think about, but has become such a common place where attackers are looking to get into the actual retailer in their network and infrastructure because they just don't have a big focus on it. And that's a real threat year-round. When we talk specifically about the holiday season, I think the one lucrative part to it would be the amount of seasonal workers that really come into these organizations, right? People being in most organizations definitely at the top of the chart for vulnerabilities when it comes to security, social engineering. But you look at the likes of Amazon hiring 250,000 people for the holiday season, Target hiring over 100,000 people. So I think that to me really would be the lure around more the holiday season when you are starting to see a lot more seasonal workers, and they're using devices, they're using a lot of pieces of technology that could become susceptible and become a larger attack vector specifically around the holiday season.
Gotcha. Appreciate your thoughts on that. David, do bad actors focus their attention more on targets they can strike when opportunity arises? For example, maybe there's known vulnerabilities with some of their systems, where there's like some long-term social engineering efforts that have been in play, that might not have anything to do with the holiday season at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say yes and no, right? They do all of these things, right? So first, bad actors strike when opportunity arises. Absolutely. Like that's, these are often, attacks of opportunity, right? And it may be a vulnerability, log4j vulnerability or something like that, that's exposing a bunch of systems that's allowing someone to get in the door. Or it may be a high profile breach that's causing, in an employee list to be available with phone numbers, addresses, names, things like that, to be able to go and pursue a specific organization. But, we have seen, especially around time of day and specific holidays, not necessarily just the holiday season, attackers strike when they think defenses are down as well, right? And when they think it's more likely that people are working remotely. So like one example, we were monitoring a scattered spider attack that was launched at 7 p.m. on Halloween. It's like a time where people's doorbells are ringing. There's all sorts of other stuff. They're most likely working from home, and as a result, there's, it's easier for them to be able to convince someone, to click on a phishing link and to accidentally, compromise their identity. As a result, you think about it, if you receive a suspicious message and you're sitting in the office, you might ask your coworker, like, hey, did you get this message? Have a conversation about it, right? You're sitting at home, you get a suspicious message, whether that's a SMS phishing attack or maybe a corporate, like a CEO impersonation attack or something like that, you're more likely to use your own judgment and not talk to others about it. More likely to maybe click on that link yourself and follow through the steps that are being asked of you and accidentally get your identity compromised as a result. The other thing that I think is interesting about sort of the seasonality of this, and John Paul, you touched on this. When you have downtime during your most lucrative time of the year, you're way more likely to get out that checkbook and write that ransomware company a check, right? Like, and to be able to, the lost revenue is greater than the ransom check that you often have to write in many of these cases. And unfortunately, the threat actors know this as well. So that one day offline, if that's one of the most critical days of the year for you, that can be that could be extremely costly. And typically with ransomware attacks, you see organizations don't get back to full productivity on average for like 21 days. So This is a time where it can be very lucrative for threat actors.
Gotcha. Thank you much for your insights on that. Stephanie, what are some common attack types that might be put in play, especially during the holiday season?
Yeah, absolutely. So you definitely see an increase of social engineering campaigns, especially when you're looking at email, text messages, and phone call. The two top ones that we see, we kind of break down into delivery or payments. So you might get a text message that your delivery is running late or your delivery was canceled, or for like payment or payment apps, there was a problem processing your order, please contact us. This time of year, everyone is spending so much more money on average. There's so many more online orders. So it's really easy to get caught up and not pay attention to those traditional red flags we typically look for. So those ones tend to be pretty successful. Another one John had mentioned was the fake retail websites or those storefronts. Huge uptick in those, and lots of consumers are falling for those. Another one is gift card draining, which is pretty interesting, where the attackers will actually go to retail locations, find those gift cards, tamper with it to get the pins and all the information from the card, and then they'll sit back and they'll keep trying it on repeat until it's finally activated. That's something I think we're going to see a huge uptick on. And then the last one that we tend to see in general, not necessarily around the holiday times, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up, is deep fakes. And the reason why I'm talking about that right now is because already mentioned, holiday times, people have their guard down, they're stressed out, they're not really taking the time to evaluate as much as they should. So something like creating a deep fake of someone's voice and calling them up in a panic state, I think that would be a lot more successful this time of year.
Gotcha. I appreciate your thoughts on that. Jake, do hackers make a concerted effort to strike as transactions are really kind of flying fast during the holiday shopping season? Is this volume of commerce something that's attractive to bad actors?
I think there's two parts to this, JP. There's certainly the avenue that retailers and those that defend systems have to take into account. The models that we've built to look at transaction volumes and abnormalities in our web applications or our checkouts or our storefronts, all the way down to new devices, as Mikhail had brought up earlier on the call. There is a myriad of different kind of changes that go through an organization when we do get into these busy times of the year. And as that happens, just as Stephanie has mentioned as well, the likelihood of being too busy to notice a slight change in a pattern of behavior of a user, obviously, falling victim or falling prey to a new system not being instrumented correctly, or just having poor controls around some of the alerts, the events that are coming through in those environments during the holiday season can be quite challenging. I think a second part of this that's very, very interesting, though, that we all really need to consider is, the consumer side of this. We're moving fast. We're getting a text from our nephew, our niece, our cousins. Hey, this is a great gift for the kids, or this is a great gift for a friend. It's about double checking and making sure that those are coming from legitimate sources, verifying those sources and obviously where you're purchasing things. And then of course, as consumers, monitoring what we've actually seen on those credit card statements in January and February as we've obviously made these purchases. This is the advice that I often give to my family: be safe, and then obviously verify later on that things haven't gone sideways, because so often adversaries are going to attempt small transactions and lay in wait, and then obviously strike later throughout the year as well once they've collected that information. So certainly an important time of the year to stay aware.
Got it. Thank you for that. Kris, are retailers, payment processors, or are there other targets typically who attackers really focus on?
Oh, well, I think the answer goes back to a lot of what the others were saying. So let's start with kind of the brutal truth that, cybercrime is very lucrative. I think I love this statistic that, the market for cybercrime today is about $10.5 trillion. Which eclipses the sale of illegal drugs, which is pretty pretty amazing when you really think about it. And those that are engaged, during the holidays, I think see the opportunity from three different vectors or three different lenses, which informs who they're going to attack. So first, on the retailers, the payment processors, and more importantly, the consumers that are engaging with those retailers and payment processors, it's just a very easy opportunity to make a buck. And so, as the others have been discussing, there's lots of fraud, there's lots of identity theft, there's sort of lots of ways to sort of scam the consumer, and as I said, you can make the money really quickly. We're also seeing nuisance attacks. I think somebody was mentioning the fact that you're much more likely to pay a ransomware sort of demand. We're also seeing things like just silly things. They have focused on the smaller businesses, like denial of service attacks focused on their O365 environments, locking them out, locking their consumers out. So those are sort of easy ways to make money fast. Second category is also recognizing this is the other than retailer, that all businesses for the most part have lots of vacation time scheduled during this time period. And so you've got your incident response teams, your systems administrators, everybody's away. And so when everybody's away, there's a real opportunity to take advantage of kind of the decreased amount of coverage, the monitoring capabilities, et cetera. And so, this is where you have preparatory attacks. We've seen everything from, Eastern crime European gangs going after sysadmins and buying their passwords, their usernames and passwords over the holiday season. Let me use your username and password for 2 weeks, to kind of the less, or the, more nefarious, which is, trying to, get into the environment, disperse backdoors, all that kind of stuff. And that's so that they can, attack the organizations later in the year. Then we also see the third grouping, and this is less, there's always a financial benefit here, but we do see some, state-sponsored or other, perhaps not state-sponsors, but very, very well-crafted campaigns that are focused, again, on more the retailers, the processors, but some of the others that are engaged from a logistics perspective and shipping, et cetera, in really trying to disrupt the flow of commerce during this time period. This is really just to hinder GDP growth. And so I'd say again, it's those three different categories, and all critical infrastructure industries or any of the supply chain partners that service those critical infrastructure industries, beyond the retailers and the payments processors, are going to be candidates for attack or heightened scrutiny during this time period, just because, as I said, it's a great opportunity to, when the, cat's away, the mice will play kind of thing.
Gotcha. Thank you very much for that great insight. And all of you, thank you for your individual thoughts on those questions. This question for all of you, and this lends itself well into some of the things that Kris was just saying, for all of you, who are retailers really defending against, or not just retailers, businesses defending against, during the holidays time, like, are these just mercenaries out for money, or, kind of leaning back to what Kris was just saying, are there geopolitical aspects to some of the actions that might be seen during this time of year?
I mean, I can probably jump in here. I mean, I think to me, a lot of what we see is a lot of mercenaries, especially this time, right? When we talk about geopolitical, I don't know if the holiday season would really be the most opportune time. I think we see a lot of that around election time and when there's change of power, transition of power between various government entities. But I think to me, it's a lot of mercenaries that are either waiting for the right time, waiting to have a much larger space to exploit, as I talked about, waiting for the seasonal workers to come in, and, a lot of organizations, like I said, it's hard to manage 250,000 workers over a few months, right? So I think there's a lot of mercenaries out there that are just looking to take advantage of this time. And as a lot of the other panelists have said, right, it is an opportunistic time. People are getting into holiday season, right? They are kind of keeping their guards down a little bit. So what we see is a lot of mercenaries, specifically when we talk about the holiday season and individual actors.
Yeah, I think it's like a pyramid, right? It's like there's 100 cyber mercenaries out there that are just financially motivated threat actors. And by the way, it might even group like North Korea into that category, right? Then there's like for every 100 cyber mercenaries, there's 10 corporate espionage people out there, and then there's one nation state.
Yep.
Right now, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be worried about all of these things, right? But because obviously the capabilities that they have goes up by an order of magnitude for each step up that ladder you go as well.
In some ways, David, I think there's a larger challenge here in terms of our internal processes and internal availability of our staff, as Kris had mentioned. There's a heightened sense of concern when we're not able to respond as well as we normally would, and when procedures change, we can often be the downfall of certain practices in our organization to respond quickly or rapidly. Are our teams available? Are disaster recovery plans in place when we don't have those kind of key folks on the calls or available on the bridges to be able to go and have these conversations? And so as much as we should remain vigilant about different categories of adversary, I think it's also about making sure that we have our internal processes, procedures, and those dialing lists in place to make sure that Christmas morning at 5 o'clock in the morning we can respond to that incident if we need to. That New Year's Day is when everyone's quiet and the systems are all kind of humming along on their own. We've got the ability to respond in a way that's reasonable and rapid. So I think it's important to consider all of them.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add one more thing, I think, it's fair to say that these organizations are protecting from everyone, right? Like we work a lot in the retail space, and for us, like you even take something like a digital display, right? You might not think a massive cybersecurity hack, but if someone walks up to that display and plugs a USB key into it, it could obviously start playing inappropriate content. It could load malicious firmware on there. So at the end of the day, they're protecting from everyone, because when we look at these vulnerabilities, regardless of the group looking to exploit them, if the vulnerabilities are there, in theory, anybody could exploit those. So I think it's just really all around, at least from where we're seeing.
Yeah, I totally agree, with what everybody said about, the motivations and the large percentage is mercenary. I think, if there was just one other actor that I think, could be out there, it'd be the hacktivist. The activist that maybe, opposes the company on some higher plane of resistance. Take like Amazon, if there's a Teamster strike, maybe I'm aligned to that group and I want to come alongside them and with the striking workers. So I'm going to attack your company and try to bring you down during the retail season so that you're hurt worse. So I think that there's a small group of those actors out there too that based on what's going on in your company or the type you're in, I'm just opposed to that, and I want to go after that. So that's the only other one I would probably add to the list.
Yeah, and I think just to add one last thing on this, I think it's also interesting that oftentimes when you sort of really unpack the box, what you find is that it's at the end of the day, it's the same person. They may be acting for different reasons. And so, a practical example is kind of in the October timeframe, prior to the sort of Russian incursion into, there was a new incursion into Kursk. We saw a lot of denial of service attacks, layer 3, layer 4 denial of service attacks that were focused on financial services institutions. But then about, a month later, they began to change to layer 7. And then what we found is that those same organizations that had been sort of committed to kind of attacking for one reason, they changed their tactics and techniques, and they started acting as a group. So these small groups started acting as one monolithic group under the coverage of something called the Black Maskers Army as a part of a... I'm so sorry. Of course, somebody's...
Dogs are always allowed on this podcast.
Sorry, there's as part of a coordinated effort to support the Palestinian cause. And so, it's the same individuals. It's just who they're working for themselves, for some other organization. It just depends. So it could be the same person for 3 different things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we've seen that as well with even like hacktivists bleeding over into financially motivated actors as well. And I think sometimes, everyone likes to think of themselves as a hacktivist as some way to kind of justify their actions as well, right? So if I'm extracting money out of the evil company or something like that, or if, someday I'm caught I want to make sure that there's some good feel good story that I can kind of try to rally around about, like, no, I'm actually a political prisoner, or something like that.
I'll throw one other interesting concept on there. We talk about who are, retailers, these organizations defending against, but like I mentioned earlier, it's also about their own internal employees, right? Like you have to defend against your own staff. You bring these seasonal workers on, and the reality is, not everyone thinks about security top of mind as an individual contributor per se, right? So you're also making sure that nobody gets social engineered and protecting your own. So I think that's an interesting factor that, and I think a lot of us think about, but doesn't always come to the forefront of these conversations.
Great point.
Stephanie, you have any thoughts on that before I go on to the next question?
Yeah, no, I think all the points are covered. I think the general question is like, who are these groups? D, all of the above, right? And I love the points that attackers are really good at pivoting, right? Whether they're going out there and their solo thing, that makes sense to group up, and it's really interesting to see when they do pivot, because that's when I think they get stronger, and that's when we should be more concerned.
Gotcha. Great. All right. Going on to the last question. What should be on not just retailers but businesses security checklists this time of year? What, if you have, like, here, like maybe the top quick couple things, like, here, you've got to look at this. This is what you should be checking. This is what you should be looking out for. It might not be completely exhaustive, but what might be those real top go-to, like, listen, really got to pay attention to these things this time of year.
Yeah, I mean, I have a very specific point when we look at retailers. To me, it's printers. It's something really interesting that we're seeing such a massive uptake in, right? I recently watched a video that talked about just exposure of printers to the internet, these network connected printers, and they found through online services, they were talking about Shodan, Binary Edge, Census, they found 800,000 printers across many different organizations that were susceptible to these attacks, right? And a lot of the time, these printers are directly wired into the network. They are on these corporate channels, no different than, a point of sale device or a lot of these items as well. So it's a very specific use case that we see, but we find that because there isn't such a high focus on these printers, because we don't think of them always as smart devices, that it's an easy gateway for organizations to kind of be able to make their way into retailers. And I think we all know that retailers use a multitude of different printing technology, from consumer to warehouse to the logistics channels. So I think that, to me, is something that we talk to a lot of our retail customers about, is making sure your printing hardware is really secured during this time. Firmware updates are done, networks are properly secured. That's a very pointed use case. That's definitely something we're seeing a lot of.
That's super interesting. It's funny because printers, I feel like, they're so overlooked, but absolutely like a gateway into an organization. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. I like to break recommendations into people, process, and technology. So I'll just focus on people and open it up for others to answer. But a lot of these scams, right, start with social engineering. And so when we bring in all these remote workers, like others have discussed on this call, a lot of times they're just like, hey, you're hired, here's your job, go. But they don't think about, they still have access to email, they still can get text messages, they're still on the network and are an entry point for attackers. So I think if we really focus on educating, especially with what current scams are going around, I do a lot of review of security awareness training, and so much of it's outdated, right? The number one thing I always hear organizations say is, watch out for typos. Well, with AI, that's not a thing anymore, right? Attackers have spell check now. So I really think a lot of these things do need to be reevaluated, and then our people need to be re-educated.
Yeah, and I mean, Stephanie, to your point, I mean, we're seeing so much of these seasonal workers come on, and they're getting these same credentials that full-time employees are getting. And, to an extent, if you don't have the right benchmarks in place, you're really giving someone full-blown access, and you're relying on them to kind of keep that information secure. So yeah, I couldn't agree more on the people front.
Yeah, and they're not going through your standard training. And also, these people are, more likely to be susceptible to be cultivated to be an insider as well, right? Yeah. Like you just want to know somebody who works at the organization. Oh, hey, what do you have access to? Can you, you may not even know what it is that you're doing, but you're getting an extra $1,000 from somebody because, and you think it's harmless. They're like, oh yeah, they're just doing analytics or something like that. But it's like, no, they're using your account to get you in the door, but you also don't really have any loyalty to this company that you've been hired on as a seasonal worker with an end date, and it's lucrative. So
I mean, the social engineering, like you look at a lot of stats in the industry, whether you have two-form authentication, you can put all the things in place, you still get that 2-3% of people across organizations like, well, you got a fake duo notification and you approved it, right? And how many courses have we all taken on security? So I definitely think there's a big aspect to that.
Yeah, and I think the evolution from just like standard phishing, like you blast out an email and you hope that people type their credentials into a form, to like this social engineering, which is almost more of like a hyper-targeted version of the same thing. You can easily convince someone to, through like whether that's like an MFA fatigue attack, or if you're using still SMS-based MFA, which I hope nobody is, like there, let me put that one on the top of the list. If somehow you're still using SMS-based multi-factor authentication, get rid of it. Get rid of it everywhere, because it is way too easy for a SIM swap attack these days to go take over someone's account with very little information. Again, cultivating an insider, who has access, and maybe a seasonal worker or something like that. So that would be the top one. And then I would agree, like Stephanie, what you were saying earlier. I think the security training these days is outdated, and the processes that we go through are outdated. SMS phishing is actually 10 times more successful than email phishing. People are 10 times more likely to click on those links, and they click on them fast too, right? So, you blast out to 500 employees at an organization, and you can get 50 of them to click on it, within minutes. And you sort of know who's susceptible then, and you can go and, launch a follow-up phone call to them or follow-up messages to go get an MFA code or attack them with some kind of MFA fatigue attack or anything like that. And, especially around the holidays, people are remote. So, target them on their mobile device. That's where you're, most likely to get their attention.
Gotcha. Right. Just want to make sure I get Jake, Kris, please.
Thing is and perhaps this makes me the oldest and maybe the most jaded on the call, but I look at the calendar and I say the likelihood that we're actually going to be able to enact any change between now and the holiday is slim to none. So, if you were to ask me, what is the one thing you should do, is make sure you have a good phone list, and not only a lot. It can't just be corporate phones. If your employees have a corporate phone, you have to assume the corporate phone's not going to work. What's the backup phone number? Have that list, and then also just run through some quick. If this happens, who am I going to call? Who's like on first? Who's going to be sort of out on a cruise? Who's going to be hammered and not able to actually talk? Because I've had that experience as well. Calling them up on New Year's and finding out they've been drinking for 12 hours. It just, having them do a forensic analysis isn't going to work. So you just need to really make sure that, your call tree of who are you going to call when things go sideways is really well defined and documented.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and as an aside to that as well, Kris, I think the old adage of no logs, no crime is just such an important part as well. We get through the holiday season, we've got retention, kind of limits of a week with a lot of tools that we have out there. We can't go and forensically analyze the systems because things have been on fire. Just ensuring that you've got a sound practice in place that kind of accounts for the increased volume of events that you're going to be seeing in infrastructure. As Mikhail brought up, different printers, devices, systems, the myriad of different attacks and devices people are going to be logging into during the holiday period to make sure that, checking on things at work. This all adds to a larger amount of digital exhaust that we have to go and analyze as threat hunters. And Kris's call on, we might speak to a defender, one of our analysts, one of our responders that isn't able to respond in a way that's going to be at their best. So making sure you can kind of regroup in January, go through and analyze the events that have happened, and then forensically reconstruct or respond accordingly. It's so important to be able to make sure you've got those processes in place, and it's not just this happy path time of year where you can jump on the morning of an incident and go and archive a lot of events to go and analyze later. It's a much more challenging endeavor that we have to think through very, very carefully.
John, your thoughts?
Well, I loved how Stephanie talked about people, process, and technology, and I know we talked a lot about people. I'll just add one thing to the people. Educate also your consumers. Let them know what you'll do and what you won't do. I'll never send you a text message with a link, something like that. I think those are always good things to say. But, from a technology perspective, keep things up to date. Vulnerabilities are still an issue for how we get in, how we compromise, companies, and so keep your point of sale terminals up to date. Keep your devices up to date. Segregate them. Don't put your printers on the same network as your point of sale. From a process perspective, Jake brought up, and I think it's really, really important. Keep monitoring. You may be compromised during the holiday season, but you won't know until June. So, you've got to do that continuous monitoring, and look for those indicators of compromise. Look for those, issues with, consumer accounts and fraud and synthetic identities that might have been created that opened up credit accounts and those kinds of things. So I think you have to be in that kind of like continual vigilance is the word I was looking for, and I think just one more thing, for companies, protect your brand. You need to be looking for people standing up and using your brand in a malicious way. Setting up a fake site or a site in the middle or another domain that's very closely aligned to yours, because those are things that they're going to use in phishing. They're going to use to fool the consumer. They're going to affect your reputation and your brand. So protect your brand and have a process by which you're actively surveilling that for misuse or because you want to protect that reputation. That's what keeps the consumer coming back. So that's the only thing I would add to the list of great panelists here today. So
Awesome. Great. So protect your brand, keep things up to date, be mindful of how you've trained and permissioned the seasonal employees, and don't let any forensics happen while people have been sipping on champagne. And keep all those things to heart. All right, great. Listen, Kris, David, Mikhail, Stephanie, John Paul, Jake, thank you all so much for making the time for the show today. I appreciate you all being on.
Thanks so much. Happy holidays, everyone, and stay safe.
To listen to the entire conversation, look for the DOS1 Hunt podcast on Spreaker, Spotify, Amazon Music, and other popular podcast platforms.